Hey everybody, hope that everybody's doing well, and we've made it through our first module and on to our second module. And as you should know by now, our second module focuses upon iconoclasts, and of course, you're in my class, so we're going to use a little bit of a fancy term here. But I think hopefully this video will serve to give you a little bit more clarity about what an iconoclast is and how they might differ from just, say, a cultural icon, though many icons can be viewed as iconoclasts. It's somewhat reminiscent of what we dealt with in terms of our first module with this idea of a non-traditional narrative. A lot of people in their discussions and their analyses and in their, even in their papers, we're writing about, narratives that was sort of harder to think of what is a traditional narrative, though I think certainly we could probably think about things that are traditional narratives, but non-traditional, something that's non-traditional was, once you start looking closely, is something that pops up all over the place. And the same, I think, is going to be, we'll find for iconoclasts, that once you start taking a closer look at, or taking, using a sort of analytical lens upon various figures of cultural impact, people who've impacted society or had some sort of cultural impact, very often they've done so in a kind of non-traditional means, if you will, or an iconoclastic means, right? They've broken the rules or they've done things a little differently. So hopefully we'll get to that idea of iconoclast. Again, I don't want it to scare anybody or be like, oh my gosh, what's this new concept? It's really just about getting us to use that as a kind of lens to realize what are the different ways that somebody has created cultural change in our society. But before we say goodbye, I should say to Module 1, there's an important thing that as far as an activity to do, as far as just leaving behind Module 1, which I'm sure we're ready to do in the RD1, it's also important to take stock of some of the things that we've done through that process, right? This class, as you know, is geared towards a kind of progression from, the papers are gradually weighted from one module to the next. So we go from 10 to 15 to 20. So in that sense, we want to make sure that we're learning the lessons that we've learned and give ourselves a chance to reflect upon those after going through our first sort of revised draft of Essay 1. And so one thing I recommend doing is writing a brief process narrative. I'm not going to require you to do this. You don't have to turn this in or anything. But again, take 10 minutes and do this. It's something that I really recommend doing. And it just involves you in using a narrative style description to write out the process through which you wrote your essay, right? I started out by doing this. A lot of times all that stuff of the writing process gets lost, right? We're just kind of are trying to get to the end, right? We're trying to make it through. And in that sense, it happens kind of in a blur, right? And a lot of times a stressful, anxious blur. But I think it's good once we're done, go back and think about it, and you can sort of use the following to help you. It's really just sort of, it's not like you're writing this for yourself. It's a kind of self-reflection. So I started out by building upon our second discussion. Then I did an element analytical point list, and then I brainstormed, whatever it might be. Then I wrote my first support paragraph, or I started writing my introduction, or I talked about it with my a friend of mine or a peer, or I talked about it with a parent or whatever it might be. I had a conversation with Professor Reed, whatever it might be that helped you. So just to give you a little sense of how you might do this to make it a little easier is just a kind of this then that formula, right? What was the first thing you did? What did you do next? And really try to just quickly describe the order of your work. Ideally, if there's something that you did that really worked well for you, it would be great if you would share that with the rest of us, So, whether it's in the comments below or even in a sort of bonfire post, that would be great. If obviously we're all going to develop our own methods, and certain things are going to work for you better than they're going to work for me or for for your peers. But the idea here is to sort of share our wealth of knowledge and our breadth of knowledge. And so if there was something you did that you felt was really productive, then talk about that. And maybe some of us could benefit from that as well. The other thing is sort of what I call flights and falls. What were the few moments where you really struggled? Where did you really hit the wall? Maybe you really hit the wall in terms of analysis. Like it was really hard to sort of dive into the analysis and develop subclaims. Or maybe you really hit the wall when it came to just coming up with a focus, right? What narrative, non-traditional narrative to write about. But also, what part of the writing process did you find easier? What were some of the sort of highlights? Like, you know what? I actually, when it came down to it, once I had the workshop draft done, the revised draft was a little easier than I thought. It's probably never going to be easy, but what are the moments that sort of really allow things, the light to come on, or the things to roll a little bit more smoothly? And those are things that you might share as well, and share the places where you really struggled, because I'm sure there's others like you who've had those struggles, and we can start thinking about ways to get through those struggles and change or sort of slightly revise our process to help ourselves through that process, through those struggles. The other thing is interactions, right? I mean, sometimes you don't even know it, but what interactions did you really find productive? We did the peer review feedback, the workshop, of course, and that can be in terms of you giving feedback. Maybe you found that quite productive. Like, what I realized, like something I should do in my introduction in reading somebody else's introduction. Or even conversations, small conversations you had. I ended up talking to a friend of mine who had also seen the same, television show I was writing about, and they brought up these points that were really sort of eye-opening, or the instructor feedback, whatever research you did, what were those interactions that were productive for you? And finally, what if you had another day? What is something that you would, no regrets, right? But if you had another day, what is something that you would do, or what else about the revised draft would you like to sort of continue to work on or develop? The idea here isn't to sort of, talk about a bunch of regrets, but sort of bring to mind, I still feel like I really want to work on, central claim. I still feel like my analysis could be a little stronger, whatever. I just wish I would have taken a little bit more time, maybe early on in the process, like before the workshop draft, to sort of outline my paper. So, sort of think of the places in which your process could be that much better next time. For this coming module, for Module 2, and that might help us think about the ways in which we can save ourselves time and energy and get an even stronger argument and analysis in place. So a process reflection, definitely something I recommend, and it's something that I do in my own teaching, even coming out of a classroom. I like to try and take down at least a few notes about things that worked well, things that I maybe really should think about changing, things that didn't work well, right? So that's certainly something I think that's valuable no matter what you're doing. But in the case of our class, reflecting upon how the whole, not just the RD1, but the whole process of that module went for yourself. Okay, so let's move on to our second module on Iconoclast. So obviously the big difference here is that we're doing the same thing in terms of an essay, right? We're writing another argumentative analysis. So there's no difference there. But instead of focusing in on some sort of narrative, a non-traditional narrative, we're instead focusing on a person, right? Some sort of iconoclast figure that has had some sort of social impact. So the idea here today is just to sort of break that down a little bit. Obviously, you should read the M2 overview, and it'll give you, a kind of introductory sense to what an iconoclast is. One of the iconoclasts that I mentioned there is Steve Jobs, right, who is become, the late Steve Jobs, right, who passed away in 2011, but who's become a sort of major iconoclastic figure, right? And I mentioned in the M2 overview how he, came up with the kind of motto of "Think Different" for Apple, the Apple company. And you've seen the ads, and we're very familiar with those kind of catchphrases because they've become so much ingrained in our culture. It's almost as if Steve Jobs now and Apple is kind of the norm, right? There was a time when Apple was not the norm. They were a fledgling company that were coming up against great odds, right? IBM was massive. It was a company that sort of owned the entire personal computing market. IBM, which stands for International Business Model, and they sort of had taken over the entire market, and Apple came along, much under the sort of guidance of Steve Jobs, and to kind of create an alternative product. And obviously, it goes without doubt. I mean, there's that Apple and Steve Jobs, if you will, and his ideas have had an extraordinary impact on our lives. In fact, changed our lifestyles when you consider that Apple obviously not only creates personal computing devices, but probably its biggest product, iPhones and iPads, the Apple Watch, all these things have really changed not only our relationships to technology, but also our relationships to business, to branding, so even to engineering, you could probably make an argument. You can go ahead and check it out. There's actually still a memorial up to Steve Jobs that at least seems to be active. I don't know that. I think it just sort of scrolls through tweets and messages of sort of memorial messages, if you will, from people that sent messages in shortly after Steve Jobs passing away. Right, so here's just a few. To the man who changed the world would not have been the same without iPod, iPhone, or iPad. But none of these would have ever existed without Steve. R.I.P. Mr. Jobs, I pray. Steve Jobs had an influence on my life, inspired me by his achievements, his reputation for quality at all costs, and mantra of making things insanely great. Have been an example to many. I hope he would be the first human to live forever. So there's a lot of adoration for Steve Jobs, and that I think is what that recognizes is that his ideas, his thinking, his actions became something more than just the individual. Right, they became iconic, and they became, and in many ways, he was iconoclastic, if you will, in the sense that he did things differently, and this had not just meaning on a social level, but also had meaning very much on a personal level for many people. So that's kind of like this sort of exemplary figure of an iconoclast. But they don't have to be that big, if you will. Your iconoclastic figure can be, operating in a much smaller arena. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about more examples before this video is done. So before I get there, I want to sort of set this scene, again, sort of like setting context in our papers. I want to set a context of why the individual in particular is so powerful in our current society. And I'm going to be giving a little bit of a gloss, right, over a kind of historical context leading up to today as to why the individual has become so powerful in society. And the second question of that is, what aspects of our current society serve to enhance the power of individuals? What is it that makes people so powerful in our current society? So one thing is American individualism, which is something that we're all probably quite familiar with. We have this idea of America being great. We have this idea of American individuals and American culture, American exceptionalism as being something that is part of our identity, if you would, our cultural identity, our national identity. We really love the idea of the individual, and that's something that we talk a lot about, all the way from our own sort of social media posts and our own conversations with one another, all the way on up to a sort of cultural history of American individualism. So that idea of, the history of great American, businessmen and businesswomen and political, and presidents and senators and congressmen and congresswomen or whatever, right? We have this, and of course, artists and things like that. We have a long list, if you will, that we sort of draw upon, MLK and Malcolm X, and we have a long list of icons that we use as a way to sort of show a kind of American culture and American exceptionalism. The other thing is also kind of having an increasingly secular society. So I'm just going to pull a few sort of headlines here from various articles, right? Where, rather than relying on a kind of divine or a kind of theistic belief system as to be the one and only sort of guiding light, it's not obviously that religion is gone or that it's not prevalent and not absolutely important to our current society. It absolutely still is. And in no ways do I mean to trivialize or demean any kind of faith. But in many ways, that kind of move towards the individual, right? The individual having such power was sort of part of, it came with a kind of secularization of society. Same with materialistic culture. The movement into massive cities and stuff like that. Really, the increase we have with leisure time, right? We have the ability to sort of develop hobbies and passions that are separate from, say, our working life, rather than working on, living a rural life, and working from, 5 in the morning until dark every single day, including Saturdays and Sundays, right? So a more leisure-based society, a more secular society is a couple things we could think about relating to the rise of the individual, if you will, and also a kind of rise of mass culture and mass media, right? So you suddenly have all these different voices being fed into our lives. Obviously with the advent of even things like newspapers, but then television, radio, of course, before that. But nowadays, as you know well, right, you're getting tweets from everybody from Kim Kardashian and LeBron James and from your, mother, father, sisters, brothers, whatever it might be, your friends. The individual, a lot of our technologies and our media is based on this kind of individual voices, our artwork. And so that's connected to a kind of rise of celebrity and consumerism. We like to sort of brand our own identities. And in some cases, we brand our identities in the wake of certain celebrities, right? I already sort of talked about how Steve Jobs had a very kind of personal, people felt like they had a personal connection or personal relationship because in many ways their identities were built around some of the kind of ideals and some of the kind of beliefs that Steve Jobs held. So it's sort of like that feeling like when your favorite band, that you've been following since day one before anybody knew about them becomes famous, and you kind of feel upset, right? Like, oh man, like that's, they've sold out, right? Well, that's kind of this idea that, you felt like you had this very personal connection and it really sort of was part of your identity, and now everybody kind of has it. It feels like it dilutes it. So the rise of celebrity and consumerism are other reasons why, and aspects of our society that seem to enhance and augment the power of individuals. So I mentioned this already, but the rise of social media and how social media has empowered. You think a lot about our most recent activist movements, things like the Black Lives Matter movement or things like the Me Too movement. Both of those movements started as hashtag movements. They were also started by individuals. Particular individuals started those movements, and a lot of those movements were based on individual stories. In many ways, you could think of the murder of Trayvon Martin being the kind of event that precipitated, not in many ways, it is exactly what precipitated the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm actually going to talk about the 3 women who started the Black Lives Matter movement here in a minute. But social media has really been the kind of really sort of primary foundation, primary catalyst for so much individual empowerment, right? So somebody, brings up something on the social media. Somebody brings up something on social media, it goes viral, and suddenly you have the whole world paying attention, right? So, the murder of George Floyd, again, I believe it was a young girl who took that video that it's just so hard to watch. I think it was a teenage girl who filmed that and posted it on social media, and that one video launched a sort of global protest for social justice and against racism in our societies and cultures. Um, the last thing is sort of wealth is power, right? The other thing is that a lot of power comes not that all iconoclasm or that all social power is based in wealth. But the fact that there are people with a lot of money who can have such kind of social impact and have such a broader audience, and have um, access to that audience in a way, obviously through things like social media and celebrity and stuff like that, has also sort of focused attention and provided attention or augmented the sort of empowerment of individuals in our society. Um, so those are some of the sort of factors, the larger contextual factors I think that play a role as to why individuals have such sway in our era. Oh, sorry, in the era of high activism. I had one more, forgot. That we also seem to be in an age where of high activism, meaning there's a lot of demonstration, there's a lot of sort of cultural upheaval and protests going on in the name of all kinds of different causes. So whether it's the students of, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting massacre, who sort of came together and started a whole movement against gun violence and against, and even we're still working to this day and speaking at Capitol Hill and so on and so forth about gun violence. And we mentioned already the protests, the global protests for social justice, the Me Too movement. We're in an age of sort of high activism that also we're seeing a lot of people who are making efforts as individuals and then in line with various larger social movements to sort of change society or set up the framework where people can be further empowered to change society. Okay, almost forgot that last one there. So I want to talk a little bit about a kind of, again, sort of continuing in this idea of the kind of this context. Two figures sort of jumped into my mind. And this quote here, again, is not meant as some sort of slander or blasphemy towards organized religion, but it's a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, who's kind of considered one of who's a philosopher, and sort of at the turn of the century in the mid 19th into the early 20th century. Actually, I think he passed away before the 20th century, but did most of his work in the mid to late 19th century, sort of the dawn of the rise of all kinds of technologies and big cities and the Industrial Revolution, all those things. So in some ways, his philosophies, he's really thinking about what is it that the modern world has changed about us as human beings. And he sort of also had a very kind of iconoclastic style, if you will. So here he writes, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all, that the world is yet owned and bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? And this is Nietzsche saying, not that, he's not speaking literally here, but he's speaking metaphorically. We seem to be becoming more and more in love with our material world and our tools and our technologies. Right, we're seeing these sort of powerful political figures come to power, and we seem to have lost that kind of, we seem to be tearing ourselves away, or we're losing that kind of, singular, let's say, kind of moral foundational structure of God, right? Now, so his interest is that it's not that he's not trying to promote some sort of atheism or like agnosticism here. What he's saying is the modern world is changing who we are, and that's kind of like what I was saying about the development of the focus upon the individual. Um, you know, the modern world. I mean, Jesus could be considered a very powerful iconoclast, of course, at the same time. And at the same time, sort of capturing this sense, and almost 100 years later, we have Andy Warhol, picture on the right, quote on the bottom. And the quote on the bottom, his one of his more famous quotes was that in the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. And this is obviously before, this is in 1968. In fact, I think I have the dates here. And this is really, him talking to what I think we see today. I mean, this is before the internet, if you will, at least the mass market use of the internet. And we have this sense of the way in which, right, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. We kind of see that with the viral nature of social media. So these are sort of two figures that kind of came to mind when I was thinking of how did we get to a place where individuals have so much power. So let's get a little bit more practical, I suppose, and start thinking about what an iconoclast actually is. Well, if we look up the dictionary definition of what an iconoclast is, the first definition is a person who attacks cherished beliefs or institutions. And the second definition, I'm going to go through. The second one is really not what we're thinking of. It's kind of a historical definition, as they point out there, but a destroyer of images used in religious worship, a destroyer of icons. An icon can also be, we probably most likely think of an icon as a, somebody like, Beyonce, right? However, icons have a historical connection and a historical definition of being kind of religious icons or religious iconography. So the Vikings would come and loot and destroy. So we're thinking about more of the first definition, but I also kind of want to put a little bit of an asterisk here. It doesn't have to be necessarily attacks. Sounds a little harsh. Certainly, your iconoclast could be somebody who is quite sort of, I don't want to say attack-minded, but is clashing with social mores very loudly and very upfront. Like say somebody like Lady Gaga, right, who in a very out loud way clashes with sort of cultural and social norms. But if we're going to sort of write our own definition for our purposes, an iconoclast is a person who uses their social position to make a significant social impact through actions and creative and professional pursuits. So there's many ways of affecting change, as we will see, but the basic idea here is just an iconoclast being somebody who creates social change, has a social impact, right, and usually does so in a kind of unusual way. They usually are kind of breaking the rules or doing something a little bit different from the mainstream in order to open up a kind of new idea, a new path of what could be done. So let's just sort of pull some examples off the top of my head. Colin Kaepernick, certainly an iconoclast figure of recent memory. Of course, most well known for kneeling during the national anthem in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin as well. And so we have a sense of the ways in which Colin Kaepernick was somebody who, kind of broke the rules, if you will, right? There were a lot of people very upset by him kneeling during the national anthem, as well as there was a lot of people who supported his efforts in doing that. But that kind of iconoclastic move, and he's gone on to make various commercials and make various public statements, and continues to be involved in things that are promoting a kind of awareness of and a demand for social justice. So certainly Colin Kaepernick, Greta Thunberg, forgive me, Greta, for mispronouncing your name, sort of came on the scene when she spoke at at least the global scene, when she spoke, I think it was at like a G8 conference on the environment, right, the sort of, the biggest countries, and sort of scolded global leaders about their lack of attention to and their lack of care, their seeming indifference to climate change, and the fact that her and her generation of young people were not going to have a safe, healthy world to live in. And she has continued to be, I think she's a little bit older now. I think she's either almost a teenager, she's like a pre-teenager, and she continues to be an activist and iconoclast in the name of um, the environment and in the name of climate change, resisting climate change. Our logo, if you will, or our icon for this module is a painting by Banksy, who's a graffiti artist or stencil artist, whatever you want to say, who has never really been seen in public, right? He chooses to be anonymous, but his artworks have become globally recognized for their kind of political power. And so, in many ways, he's very much an iconoclast figure in the sense that now he's not using his celebrity, like his face, his beauty, his fame, his wealth, necessarily to create a message or have a social impact. He's using his artwork. And creates these anonymous artworks that have some sort of social commentary. So here we have the flower thrower painting, which is actually on a wall in Jerusalem. It's on a wall that divides, a very famous wall that divides Jerusalem and Palestine, that is obviously a kind of, as some would refer to it, as kind of the world's biggest, turns Palestine into the world's biggest open prison. But separates Jerusalem and Palestine, who've obviously had, a lot of conflict from the past. I mean, for all memory almost. So he paints this image of a protester throwing instead of, rather than a Molotov cocktail or some sort of weapon, a stone, throwing a bouquet of flowers. Another thing, when you look at this, is that there was actually in 2005 a kind of gay pride parade near this spot in Jerusalem, and I think some 5 or so gay pride participants were murdered by a bunch of sort of vigilantes or militia that came in and killed them. So it's connected to sort of multiple political issues there, but Banksy certainly can be seen as an iconoclast. And here you have, which most of us probably didn't know, the 3 women, including myself, until I actually did a little research and looked it up, the 3 women who started the Black Lives Matter movement, or started the Black Lives Matter hashtag, and I believe are responsible for putting together maintaining the website and obviously putting on all kinds of talks and events and participating in protests and organizing protests who keep it alive. It's I think from left to right you see Patrice Cullors. In the middle is Opal Tometi, and on the far right is Alicia Garza. So they are the 3 iconoclasts, if you will, who are behind the Black Lives Matter movement, and certainly a kind of iconoclastic movement that's trying to bring awareness to the racism and the white supremacy that is not only has come up in our legal system, in our justice system, in our law enforcement system, but it also seems to be structured into so much of our society. So those are examples of 4 iconoclasts, or 6 iconoclasts, I guess you could say, total, and that are active today. What is an iconoclast? So it's more than just iconic, and that's what I'm kind of getting at. So something we might think of as an icon is like LeBron James. Now, the reason, like I said, I'm using that term iconoclast is to sort of imply that there's something. What are the things that they do that are different than just your standard icon, right? So LeBron James, most of us know LeBron James as a basketball player, an extraordinary basketball player. But there's a lot that LeBron James does in terms of having some sort of sociocultural impact beyond just being a great basketball player. He does a lot of things, and so I'm going to bring these up, that makes him kind of iconoclastic. It's like, well, LeBron, just shut up and play basketball, right? Which, what a stupid and horrible thing to say. I believe that was said by somebody recently when LeBron started speaking out about things regarding social justice. Um, but LeBron is sort of superhuman and iconoclastic in the sense of all the things that he does for social impact. So one thing that we're probably also familiar with is the way in which, and this is way back when LeBron James was with the Miami Heat, and after the murder of Trayvon Martin, getting his whole team to wear hoodies, hooded sweatshirts, right? Trayvon Martin was famously killed while wearing a black hooded sweatshirt. And so wearing these hoodies in a way to show sort of solidarity, raise awareness, right? So you can see all the hashtags on LeBron James' tweet there, right? We are Trayvon Martin, hoodies, stereotype, we want justice. And this is really kind of even before the Black Lives Matter movement. So using his celebrity and his platform as a way to raise awareness about social issues, beyond basketball. And this continued also with his public appearances. I believe this was at the ESPY Awards, the ESPN Sports Awards. And right here he is with Chris Paul, Carmelo Anthony, Dwayne Wade. I did those out of order, and LeBron himself, of course, in the bow tie there, all speaking out against the just again in response to Trayvon Martin, but speaking out in general against the killing of primarily black men at the hands of so many law enforcement officers, and raising awareness about that issue and speaking directly about it. Not just tweeting about it, but now speaking directly about it on a national television show. You also see LeBron here getting his friends and his colleagues to spread the message with him. Again, this is pre-Black Lives Matter movement. The other thing you probably know about is LeBron's school in Akron, which I think is called the I Promise School. And it's a school for, I think, elementary all the way up until middle school, eighth graders, I believe, where kids who are at-risk learners from his hometown of Akron, Ohio, are not only given a wonderful school that's fully resourced, right, but they're also sort of kept on track and given resources to provide them to get to college and graduate college as well. So the I Promise School, I think, people know, like famously, I think everybody gets their own iPad and everybody gets their own, probably high-speed internet and access to all these resources that most of these kids, most of which who are kids of color, did not have access to due to, in much part, due to structural racism in our society. Part of the school is part of the LeBron James Foundation, which is, again, sort of is based in Akron, Ohio, but it sort of extends the kind of, the I Promise School is just one aspect of what the LeBron James Foundation does in terms of not only sort of providing resources and support for these young kids, from elementary up into the 8th grade, but then beyond that, right, kids who go on and how they can, giving them places and avenues for which to interact with society to have some sort of larger social impact beyond college and during college. LeBron is also a producer. He produces films and television shows. So one, for example, is the show called, it's a series, a limited series called Self-Made, about the life of Madam C.J. Walker, who I think started out as a servant and became one of the richest black women at the turn of the century, self-made. Made her own money. So all the way up from scrubbing floors, so to speak, all the way up into the penthouse as a black woman, which was something remarkable, obviously, for that era. And so producing, putting his name behind and putting his money behind these projects that are creating, a non-traditional narrative, if you will, that are challenging sort of that are iconoclastic in nature. Finally, most recently, LeBron James started the More Than a Vote, or is one of the main catalysts or drivers behind More Than a Vote, the More Than a Vote sort of campaign and program that was designed to get, in particular, the African American population out to vote in the last election, and in all elections, right, to make sure, that registered and that they weren't experiencing any sort of blocking or discrimination against voting. And other of his athletic colleagues joined him on this program. The point here is obviously that LeBron James does a lot more than, score triple doubles on a regular basis in the NBA. LeBron James has his hands and his eyes and his ears and his voice involved in so many different ways that makes him very much a kind of iconoclastic figure in the way that he really dynamically engages and challenges our status quo and cultural norms. Okay, so I'm going to sort of end there, and I'm looking forward to sort of being in a new topic here, right? While there was some obviously wonderful work done with our non-traditional narratives and that sort of narrative futures module, hope that we're sort of this new topic will give us a little more new life and energy, and I look forward to all those conversations and discussions. All right, everybody, talk soon. Take care.